Morton has always been a town with a lot of what you might call curiosities. Being quite an old town, it has over the years amassed a whole bunch of locations to which stories or legends are attached. Local landmarks that everyone in town seems to know about, but those outside of the area would drive or walk past without giving them a second glance, which is understandable. The strange thing about Morton's many sights to see is that they are still, to this day, only passed on by word of mouth. You won't find them on TripAdvisor or Atlas Obscuria. No TV crews from the local news come to do pieces about the new arcade or Fuller's Woods, and yet every kid in the town knows the field where old Ragbag the Scarecrow stands, or where on the Marston estate the so-called dead phone used to be. They are exercises in local myth and map-keeping that you only become familiar with by spending some time in the place. Even then, actually visiting is sometimes inadvisable. But as they say, there is always an exception to the rule. One of our childhood landmarks that did make the national news and would be considered a genuine attraction to the outsiders were it ever advertised would be the Stonemasons' Gardens, the walking gallery showcasing the work of local artist John Hunt. Even today, if you drive into Morton from the east, you will pass on the left-hand side of the road, not a generic road sign or hand-painted billboard welcoming you to the town, but a huge boulder with the name of the town expertly carved in large Gothic letters for all to see. My friends and I often joke that whilst this was a classy way to mark the border of the town, it was also a very fitting one. Firstly, because it somewhat resembled a tombstone, showing that the town was dead and boring, offering little in the way of attraction to the uninitiated, and secondly, because it simply had the town's name as a stone-carved statement of fact. Nowhere on the thing was there any suggestion of welcome, just a declaration that this is where you are, for better or for worse. The reason I mention this huge hunk of rock is because it was also carved in the 1980s, though it looks much older, by John Hunt. A stonemason and sculptor working mostly on stone taken from the local quarries, Hunt had acquired somewhat of a double-edged reputation by the time I heard of him. On the one hand, he was a talented artist who had gained some level of national fame. On the other hand, he was an eccentric old recluse who by all accounts was as miserable and cantankerous as he was ancient. For a brief time in the 1970s, he had been the toast of the city and had in fact lived there with his wife for a number of years. Back then, he was famed for his images of men and women, carved in idolized beauty like Greek gods. A feat made more impressive by the fact that he worked in granite, slate, and other kinds of stone that were apparently much harder to manipulate with the chisel than traditional marble. A few years later, however, Hunt moved back to Morton. Having been born in the town, he apparently missed the quiet and isolation of the place and found the city to be too noisy and full of liars. Whilst he was welcomed back to the town and even spoken of as something of a local celebrity, very few people ever actually interacted with him, and it was rumored that his true reason for retreating back to his hometown was because of a split with his wife, who had apparently run off with the Spanish art dealer that Hunt had been working with. Living alone in a huge but out-of-the-way house somewhere towards the top of Moncton Road, Hunt gave up selling his pieces and instead starting to work simply for himself and his own satisfaction. The resulting work was a very different character to what he had produced before. The Stonemason's Garden, or John Hunt's private hell, was a stretch of land behind Hunt's property which over the next 10 years he populated with the most hideous and grotesque abominations, all carved in stone, that you have ever seen. This statue garden, which consisted of creatures, demons, half-human hybrids, twisted braids of serpents and insects, covered a vast piece of open land and was dotted and studded with the most horrendous effigies. In one corner was a face lying flat on the earth that you could only see by standing over it. The mouth had been dug out into a huge pit over which enormous fangs hung down. On another side was an entire wall covered with grasping hands, the reaching, pleading fingers of the damned, calling and clutching out to any semblance of salvation never to come. There were horned beasts, leathery reptilian things with scales and wings, huge lions with multiple heads and carved suggestions of architect that would put Rodin to shame. Great arches and exquisite carved gates, steps that led to nowhere and fountains only filled with rotting leaves. The only exception to the repulsive character of the statue's subjects was one perfectly rendered portrait in stone of his former wife, whom he had depicted running as if in terror and panic through this strange forest. This sculpture alone was what you might call normal, in that it was a depiction of a human being rather than a monster. Yet I always felt it was one of the most fearful pieces in the entire garden. Something about the way the garments, carved in stone and yet looking as delicate as muslin, flapped behind her, tattered and torn by the talons of her punishers. Something about the width of her eyes, bulging open as a mouth contorted into a scream of untold terror. A vision of abject fear that was more unnerving than all of the other goblins and grotesques put together. It was as if, they used to say, Hunt had been so hurt by his wife's betrayal that he spent the rest of his life carving an image of her running, at full speed and terrified, through the hell to which he wished to send her. The gardens themselves were an exquisite piece of work, and on account of Hunt being entirely housebound during the day, not to mention nobody bothering to check, the place was also open to the public. Every few months you would hear that a new piece had been added, or that Hunt had been seen out at a ridiculous hour hammering away with his chisel and creating some new collection of gargoyles for his statue forest. When I was a kid, going up to the garden at night was a dare that we used to tease each other with, and one that a lot of us tried out. Creeping as quietly as we could around the huge statues and trying not to show that we were frightened when we stepped in some gargoyle's shadow. Those dares and the tendency for people to go touring the grounds came to an end, however, in 1999, when a story appeared in a local rag newspaper about the voices up there. The report, which included an interview with Mrs. Mapplethorpe, who just happened to be one of my old teachers, and several other witnesses whose names I can't remember, talked at length about statues that talked. In the article, Mrs. Mapplethorpe spoke in all seriousness of having heard the strange stone beasts whispering to others and having crossed the road to take a closer look, how she saw one of them move. The other witnesses spoke of how the garden, though perfectly still on a summer's night, was still full of echoes, whispers and half-heard shouts that seemed to writhe and squirm around the legs and torsos of the statues like a mist. One man even spoke of how he had, through some trick of the light, seen the shadows of these statues cast by the light of the moon onto the overgrown tangles of grass and weeds become detached, unfixed from their moorings on the statue and instead slithering oily and black around the gardens like snakes. In most towns, this would have been enough to drive the locals into a frenzy of excitement, and they would have queued to get into place to see the alleged phenomena. In most towns, but not Morton. Enough has happened here for the locals to be wary, so when such stories and mutterings began to emerge, the people decided to give the place a wide berth. My friends and I were banned from going up there, even on our childish dares, and the entire garden, presumably added to periodically by Hunt himself, fell into rack ruin and disrepair. In 2004, John Hunt died. His body was only discovered sometime after his death when a passerby, walking hurriedly past the now-shunned gardens, noticed an awful smell coming from the inside of the house to which the gardens belonged. His death made local and regional headlines, though the national press largely ignored it. In 2007, however, an art dealer from London proposed an exhibit of Hunt's work as a retrospective. Having bought the house in which Hunt lived and presumably gained ownership of all the works held within the grounds, began organizing to have them moved and rearranged in a similar configuration at an exhibit space somewhere near London. It was only when the workers began shifting the pieces, however, that those old rumors began to reemerge. Several of the men charged with the moving quit, point blank, with most of them refusing to give a reason or explanation as to why. Others, more willing to take the payday from the local newspaper, talked about hearing strange moaning noises in the garden after sunset, whilst another, whom I have met personally, swore black was white that one statue, the figure of an enormous horned satyr, actually winked at him as he prepared to move it. Of course, such stories are probably misunderstandings, delusions, or lies. What cannot be written off so easily, however, was a discovery that made the national news. In that case, there was cold, hard evidence. Upon digging out the base of the portrait of Hunt's estranged wife, a number of workers reported hearing a woman crying. This was dismissed once again as nonsense, and the huge statue was hooked up to a winch in order to be carefully transported to its new home. Until it cracked, splitting through the middle and falling, to reveal that unlike the many monster statues that surrounded it, this carving was in fact hollow. The bones of a woman found to have been stored within have never been formally identified, though it's an interesting fact that no record of Mrs. Hunt after her affair with the art dealer has ever been found, and her whereabouts to this day is unknown. Local legend would have it that Hunt, enraged by jealousy, killed his wife and hid her body inside the sculpture. The planned move of the other statues was scrapped, and they remain up there, in place, the half-smashed remnants of someone's sculpted coffin standing at the dead center. If listed on travel sites, they would surely be attractions to some. The locals, however, tend to stay away.